What is a sweat test and why might you need one? Hi, it's Dan from UK Bike Fit and we're going to talk about sweat testing and how it can benefit you. The aim of a sweat test is to find out the concentration of sodium within your sweat so that when you're training, you know how much sodium and electrolyte you should be drinking to make sure you're hydrated properly throughout the entirety of your session. If you don't know the concentration of sodium within your sweat, then it is impossible to tell whether you're hydrating efficiently or not. So for that reason, I think everyone should get a sweat test who hasn't had a sweat test, but there are a few common signs and symptoms that are really commonplace if you're not hydrating effectively. These symptoms include headaches, cramping, stopping for a pee constantly when you're exercising, underperforming, and fatigue. So what is actually involved in a sweat test? Loads of people seem to think that you actually have to do some exercise to do a sweat test, but actually all we do is sit down and put these discs containing a chemical that induces sweat onto your arm, and we collect that sweat to test it with. The concentration of sodium within your sweat is genetic, so it can vary from as low as 200 milligrams per litre up to 2000 milligrams per litre per person, and there is no other way to test the sodium concentration in your sweat without doing a sweat test. Once you've done a sweat test, that result stays with you forever. The only time that sodium concentration varies in your sweat is if you go through some sort of period of heat acclimatization training, but other than that, the result is going to stay exactly the same for the whole of your life. So once we have the results of the sweat test, you can know exactly how much sodium and how much electrolyte you should be drinking during your training sessions and during your races to make sure you're optimally hydrated throughout the entirety of the race. We've just put the sweat collector on Jen's arm over that patch of skin that is sweating, and there's a little bit of blue dye under the sweat collector. So as it draws the sweat up, it turns the sweat blue so we can see it within the tube. And then once we've got enough sweat within that tube, we're going to take it out and feed it into the analyzer and see what the result is. Whilst this is going on during the test, we'll ask you some questions about your activity, about your exercise, what you get up to, the type of intensity that you do, how many hours per week do you exercise, and of course ask you some questions about your current sweat rates and current symptoms that you've been having, so that when we come to analyse the results and see how much sodium is in your sweat, we can relate that to you as an individual and give you an individualised hydration plan after the result.
So after my sweat was collected, we saw the number on the screen and we put that through our online software to find out what my sodium content is in my sweat, and the result is 1,105 milligrams per litre of sweat. It's important to recognise that this number is the quantity of sodium that I lose per litre of sweat and not my sweat rate. Now that I know this number, the concentration of sodium in my drinks doesn't have to change. However, we need to be aware that your sweat rate will change depending on the type of session you're doing and the conditions that you're training in.
To measure your sweat rate, weigh yourself naked before and after a training session, and the weight in grams that you lose is equivalent to the millilitres of sweat lost during that session. It's important to note the conditions that you trained in, because obviously in hotter, more humid conditions you're going to sweat more, and in cooler conditions you're going to sweat less, and also the intensity that you did that session at. The harder you're going, you're always going to lose a bit more sweat than if you're going easier on a session.
Once we've got this result, we'll give you some advice of how to put your hydration plan into action to hopefully avoid any symptoms of dehydrating and make sure you're getting the most out of your training and racing.
If you want to get booked in for a sweat test, check out the UK Bike Fit website at ukbikefit.com.